Daniel Afolabi was 41 years old when his ex-wife looked at him across a restaurant table at their daughter's birthday dinner, smiled the specific smile she reserved for things she found beneath her, and said, loudly enough for the table to hear, "You know, Daniel, some men are just built for small lives, and there's nothing wrong with that." She was wearing a $4,800 dress. Her new husband, a mortgage broker named Trevor who smiled with all his teeth and none of his eyes, laughed first. Two of her friends laughed after him. Daniel's daughter, Imani, who was turning 16 that evening and who had inherited her father's habit of going very still when she was angry, said nothing and looked at her fork. Daniel said nothing either. He picked up his water glass, he took a drink, he set it back down. He had $1.3 billion in assets under management across 4 holding companies, 2 technology platforms, a commercial real estate portfolio spanning 6 cities, and a philanthropic foundation that had, that morning, been contacted by the governor's office about a partnership initiative. Celeste had no idea. She had not asked a single question about his life in 8 years. She had decided on the afternoon she served him divorce papers in the kitchen of the house he had paid for that Daniel Afolabi was a finished calculation. She had never been more wrong about anything in her life. What happened next, when the magazine hit, when the call came, when Imani showed her the cover, would cost Celeste the thing she valued most, the story she had been telling about herself for 8 years. Before we get into it, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from right now. And subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you genuinely cannot afford to miss. The alarm went off at 5:03 a.m. on a Thursday in September, 6 weeks before the birthday dinner. Daniel reached across the nightstand and silenced it before the second pulse, the way a man does who has been waking at the same hour for so many years that the alarm is less a necessity than a formality, a confirmation that the day has started, not a command to begin it. He lay still for a moment. The Houston morning was dark outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse on the 43rd floor. The city spread below him in grids of amber and white light. The bayou invisible in the distance, but present the way things you've known a long time are present even when you can't see them. He got up. He made his own coffee, a specific ritual, grounds measured by weight on a small digital scale he kept on the counter, water at exactly 94 degrees, a pour-over that took 4 minutes from start to finish, a process he had maintained through every version of his life, because some things you keep, not because they are efficient, but because they are yours. He carried the cup to his desk, which faced east, and he sat down and opened his notebook, handwritten. Black ink. He had kept a notebook every day for 22 years, beginning in the 3rd year of his MBA, when a professor, whose name he still remembered, told the class that the discipline of writing down one true thing every morning was worth more than any strategy framework they would ever learn. He wrote one thing. He closed the notebook. He opened his laptop. The work was the same work it had always been. At its core, he saw things before other people saw them. He had been doing this since he was 24 years old and working as a junior analyst at a commercial real estate firm in Houston, reading market data at 11 at night while his colleagues went to bars, building spreadsheet models no one had asked him for, and leaving them in his supervisor's inbox, because the models were right and he needed someone to know they were right. His supervisor's name was Gerald Cole, and Gerald Cole had done the most important thing a manager can do for a young analyst with a specific kind of intelligence. He had put the models in front of the people they mattered to and made sure Daniel was in the room. Gerald had told him once, handing back a corrected report, "You don't think like an analyst. Start acting like it." Daniel had been 26. He had kept that sentence in every notebook since. He had met Celeste at 29. She was beautiful and confident and socially precise in a way that Daniel, whose intelligence ran toward patterns and structures rather than rooms, had found genuinely impressive. She worked in luxury brand marketing. She knew how to enter a space and claim it. She had looked at Daniel and seen something she thought she understood, a quiet, serious man with good prospects and no particular flair. a man she could position correctly in her life, a man whose steadiness would provide the foundation her ambitions required. She had not been wrong about his steadiness. She had been entirely wrong about what it was steadying. They married when he was 31. He had already by then made his first real move, a commercial property acquisition in a Houston corridor that three larger firms had passed on because the development timeline looked uncertain. He had spent 4 months analyzing the corridor, the infrastructure plans, the zoning history, the migration patterns of the anchor tenants who would eventually drive foot traffic, and he had concluded that the uncertainty was temporary and the upside was significant. He had purchased the property through a holding company he had established in his own name 2 years earlier, with his own capital, which was modest at the time, and a private note he had negotiated with a lender who had worked with Gerald Cole and who knew Daniel's work. He had not mentioned the acquisition to Celeste, not because he was hiding it, because she had never asked what he did with his money. He had assumed she would eventually ask. She never did. The marriage lasted 7 years. It deteriorated slowly and then completely the way structural failures always do. A long accumulation of small stresses that individually seem manageable. Then one morning you look at the whole and understand that the tolerance has been exceeded for some time. Celeste had expected, in some wordless and deeply held way, that his career would produce the kind of visibility she valued: profiles, invitations, the specific social positioning that comes from being attached to someone recognizable. What his career produced instead was wealth that did not announce itself, built through transactions that happened in conference rooms and on spreadsheets, through a process that had no photographs and generated no press and required above all the ability to be very patient and very quiet for very long stretches of time. She had begun in the 4th year to describe his work at dinner parties in terms that contained a carefully calibrated disappointment. Daniel does real estate sort of investment stuff. It's quite technical. The word technical delivered in a tone that meant uninteresting, that meant small, that meant not what I signed up for. She had found Trevor in the 6th year. He was a mortgage broker with a good haircut and an easy laugh and the specific confidence of a man who has confused presentation for substance. He was visible in a way that Daniel was not. He played golf with people whose names Celeste recognized. He knew the owner of the restaurant she liked. Daniel found out the way he found out everything that mattered, not through confrontation, but through attention. A text notification on her phone that she turned face down too quickly. A name repeated in conversation with the specific casualness of deliberate underemphasis. A Saturday afternoon unaccounted for, and the quality of the explanation when she returned. He had added the details together precisely the way he added any set of data, and when he had a complete picture, he had gone to see his attorney. Raymond Park, family law, 15 years of practice, a reputation in Houston's legal community for the specific quality of never losing his composure and never losing a case he'd prepared correctly. Daniel had come to Raymond with a yellow legal pad on which he had written, in precise columns, every relevant financial fact of the marriage: assets, timeline of acquisition, structure of holding companies, valuation estimates. Raymond had reviewed the pad for 6 minutes without speaking. Then he had said, "Most of what you've listed here was established before the marriage or through structures that predate it. Her exposure is significantly more limited than she is going to assume." Daniel had nodded. He had already known this. He had wanted confirmation. Raymond had provided it, and then he had said, "She's going to think she has more leverage than she does. Let her think that until I tell you otherwise." Celeste had entered the settlement process with the confidence of someone who had misread a structural plan. She believed, on the basis of the jointly filed tax returns she had access to, that Daniel's financial position was substantially what she had seen across the table at dinner for 7 years: comfortable, solid, not spectacular. What she did not know was that the holding company structures Raymond had reviewed were legally distinct from marital assets by years and documentation that was unambiguous. What she did not know was that the commercial corridor acquisition had, by the time of the divorce, appreciated to a position that made it one of the most valuable private real estate holdings in Houston's Midtown district. She had not known about the acquisition. She had not asked. She had looked at the joint returns and made her number, and she had been wrong by a factor she would not understand for 8 more years. She took the house in River Oaks, which was fair. She took the vehicle she had chosen, a white Range Rover, which was fair. She took a settlement figure that Raymond had negotiated down with a precision that Daniel still admired when he thought about it, not so low as to invite challenge, not so high as to reflect the actual position. Celeste had walked out of the settlement with what she believed was a victory. She had filed the paperwork, she had gotten the house, she had Trevor, she had won. She had said to her friends, in the months that followed, that Daniel had simply never been able to keep up with where she was going. Her friends had nodded. This story required no villain, because it assigned none. It was merely a story about two people who were not suited to each other, and one of them had been wise enough to leave. Daniel had moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Midtown. He had taken his notebooks, his pour-over equipment, his grandfather's chess set, and approximately 12% of his actual net worth. He had driven a 2012 Lexus with a cracked leather armrest that he kept meaning to get repaired. He had said goodbye to Imani on a Tuesday night and told her that Tuesday nights and every other weekend were his, and that she could call him any time, any hour, for any reason, and he meant that completely. She had been 8 years old. She had said, "I know, Daddy." She had already understood more about him than her mother ever had. The 8 years between the divorce and the birthday dinner were, from the outside, not a dramatic story. There was no single event, no lottery ticket, no inheritance, no windfall. There was a man who woke at 5:03 a.m. every day and made his coffee and wrote one true thing in his notebook, and then went to work on problems that had solutions if you were patient enough to find them. The second acquisition followed the first, the third followed the second, a technology investment in year 4 of the post-divorce period, a logistics software company he had identified by reading, for 3 consecutive months, every report on supply chain friction in the commercial real estate sector, had returned 14 times the initial capital when it was acquired by a larger platform in year 7. He had reinvested again. Raymond Park had restructured the holding companies twice to accommodate growth that had exceeded the original projections by a margin that made even Raymond, who was not easily surprised, pause and recalculate. By year 8, Daniel Afolabi was not a successful investor. He was something that required a different category. He had not publicized this, he had no social media presence, he had declined 3 requests for profiles from regional business publications. He had accepted speaking invitations only when the cause was one he cared about. Twice for trades education initiatives, once for a university entrepreneurship symposium at the invitation of a dean who had been his professor 20 years earlier. He had, that September, agreed to be profiled in a national business magazine, the first such profile he had accepted, because the editor was someone he had known for 11 years through a mutual board membership, and because the foundation work had reached a scale where the exposure would serve programs that needed it. The profile had been written over 2 months of reported interviews. It would publish in November. He had not mentioned it to Imani. He would let her see it when it came out, because she had earned the right to be surprised by good news. He had not mentioned it to anyone in his life who knew Celeste. There was no strategy in this, there was simply the fact that he had never been in the habit of announcing himself. The birthday dinner was at a restaurant in River Oaks on a Saturday evening in October. Imani had wanted a small dinner. Family, which in her careful construction of that word meant her father, her grandmother on Daniel's side, 2 friends, and her mother's household. Daniel had arrived 5 minutes early and been the first one seated. He had ordered water and reviewed a contract summary on his phone, and put the phone away when Imani arrived and did not take it out again for the rest of the evening. He was wearing a dark jacket and a white shirt, no tie, the same clothes he wore to most things that were not site visits, because he had never seen the value in adjusting his appearance to manage other people's impressions. Trevor had ordered a bottle of wine that he announced the name of and told the table the vintage and explained briefly what made it notable. Daniel had declined a glass, he didn't drink, and Trevor had said, with a smile that occupied only the front portion of his face, "Of course, yes, very wise, very disciplined," in a tone that made discipline sound like a limitation. The conversation moved through the meal in the way it always did at these dinners, surface and careful, the two households performing civility for Imani's sake, which was the correct thing to do and which both Daniel and Celeste were capable of, though for entirely different reasons. He was civil because Imani needed her mother and because causing damage to that relationship served no one he cared about. Celeste was civil because her social identity required the performance of graciousness. It was during dessert, Imani's cake, candles lit, the small ceremony of 16 accomplished, that Celeste had said the thing. Daniel had been watching Imani's face in the candlelight, the particular expression his daughter wore when she was genuinely happy, which was different from the expression she wore in photographs, more open, the guard down. He had been thinking that she looked, in that specific light, like his mother at the same age, which was a thought that arrived without warning and carried its full weight. And then Celeste's voice came across the table with the specific brightness of a woman who has had 2 glasses of wine and is performing for her husband's benefit. "You know, Daniel, some men are just built for small lives, and there's nothing wrong with that." He had heard it the way he heard everything, completely and without urgency. He had picked up his water glass, he had taken a drink, he had set it back down. He had not looked at Imani because he did not want to make her responsible for managing his reaction. He had looked at Celeste with the expression he brought to incorrect projections and mispriced assets, patient, unbothered, faintly interested. He said nothing. He drove Imani home to her apartment. She had moved into her own place in September, her first, a fact that had required Daniel to sit in his car for 4 minutes after helping her carry in the last box because he needed a moment that was not performed for anyone. And he walked her to her door, and she hugged him with both arms and said into his shoulder, "I'm sorry about what she said." He had said, "Don't be. She doesn't know what she's talking about, and that's not your fault or your problem." Imani had pulled back and looked at his face the way she always did when she was checking whether he meant something. He had meant it. She could see that he did. She had said, "She's going to feel so stupid when the magazine comes out." He had raised an eyebrow. She had grinned. He had not asked how she knew about the magazine, because Imani always knew the things he tried to quietly arrange, and this had been true since she was 9 years old, and he had long since stopped being surprised by it. The magazine hit newsstands on a Tuesday in November. The cover was Daniel's photograph. He had sat for it in his building's lobby, leaning against a column, the city visible through the glass behind him. The profile framing him as one of the most significant private investors operating in the American commercial real estate and technology sectors, the headline named him, it named the number. It named the foundation, it named with the specificity that good financial journalism requires, the approximate current valuation of the holding companies and the technology investments and the real estate portfolio. The number was not modest. Imani texted her mother the morning the issue released. She sent the cover image with no caption. Celeste's response came 47 minutes later, 47 minutes in which Daniel understood when Imani showed him the exchange. She had presumably read the article, verified the publication, verified the number, and sat with what she was now required to understand. The response was a single word: "Oh." Imani had added 3 laughing emojis and sent it to Daniel. He had looked at the screen for a moment, and he had felt something that was not triumph and was not satisfaction and was not happiness exactly. It was closer to the feeling he had when a model he had spent months building was validated by the outcome, the quiet, factual confirmation that the work had been correct, that the patience had been warranted, that the thing he had believed was true had turned out to be true. It was not about Celeste. It had never been about Celeste. She was not the audience he had built for. She was simply someone who had believed a thing that was not accurate and was now in possession of the correct information. She called him 3 days later. He answered, because he always answered calls from numbers connected to Imani's life. She asked if they could have lunch. He said, "What for?" She said there were things she wanted to say. He said, "Celeste, I'm not interested in an apology, and I'm not interested in a conversation about the past. If you have something to say that is relevant to Imani, I'm available for that. For anything else, I don't have time." She had started to say something. He had said, "Take care of yourself." He had ended the call. His 5:03 a.m. alarm went off the following Thursday. He silenced it before the second pulse. He made his coffee, grounds by weight, water at 94 degrees, 4 minutes. He sat at the desk that faced east, and he opened his notebook and he wrote, "One true thing." He closed the notebook. He opened his laptop. Outside, the city was dark and present and full of patterns that had solutions if you were patient enough to find them. He was not a man who looked back. He had never needed to. He had the work, he had the notebooks, he had Imani, who had called the night before to tell him that she had decided to accept the fellowship she had been considering, the policy research position in Washington, and that she was terrified and certain simultaneously, which he had told her was the correct emotional state for every genuinely right decision. He had heard her laugh. He had heard in her laugh his mother, and something that was entirely her own, and the particular sound of a person who has been loved without condition for 16 years and has learned to recognize that sound in herself. He had built that, all of it, one day at a time, one model at a time, one notebook at a time. One true thing written at 5:03 in the morning, when the city was still dark and the work was still waiting and there was no audience for any of it except the work itself. The magazine sat on the corner of his desk, unopened, its own cover facing down. He had read the article in proofs. He did not need to read it again. He knew what it said. He knew what it meant. He knew, more precisely than any article could convey, exactly how it had been built, year by year, decision by decision, in the specific silence of a man who had never needed anyone to see him to know exactly what he was. She had called it a small life. He poured the last of the coffee. He looked at the city coming into light below him. He had 43 meetings this month, 14 active acquisitions under analysis, a foundation board meeting on Friday, a site visit in Nashville on Monday, and a Tuesday night dinner with Imani in her new apartment where he was going to bring groceries and cook, which she had requested specifically. Because she had said she wanted to learn how he made the jollof rice. He had said he would teach her. He had meant that completely. I hope that one stayed with you. Hit like if it did. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. I've picked 2 more out that I think you're going to want to see.